Hello, everybody. We continue this study, or at least this opportunity for this study, which is online only, and essentially me providing some overview of each of the chapters of the study. We do have on Sunday following worship opportunities to be involved in in-person conversations as part of our AOL, and on Thursday as part of our Thursday, which that link comes out in our Wednesday email each week. The resource again is Jesus' Vision for Your One Wild and Precious Life on things like poverty, hunger, polarization, inclusion, and more by Mike Graves. And so we looked at the introduction in chapter 1 this past week. And so now we are exploring chapter 2. Chapter 2, Good News to the Poor, Justice for the Most Vulnerable. Just to remind ourselves, his focus is that we miss out the most important things about Jesus and his life when we focus just on his death, and how so much attention has been given to the death of Jesus, be it in the traditional Apostles' Creed, be it in Christian art, be it in popular media, that it only represents the tiniest portion of his overall life. And in the public ministry of Jesus, which the Gospels themselves are accounts of, 90% or so of the entire Gospel represents the teaching and healing ministries of Jesus, and only 10% represents that final little moment in Jesus's life. And so he seeks to shift the balance, particularly in the season of Lent, by saying, let's focus on the first things of Jesus's public ministry, as that will highlight some of the most important things in Jesus' life and ministry, and some of the things that are gifted to us who follow Christ into living and leading our life to the fullest, that these really are the teachings and things that can unleash us and unleash our lives to really be blessed. So chapter 2, Good News to the Poor, goes from chapter 1, which was about the first thing that Jesus did, the call of the disciples, so sort of this apprenticeship, if you will, into now chapter 2. This is his first sermon. So he uses the central scripture for this time comes from Jesus' return to home after he's called the disciple and begun ministry out in the Galilean countryside. But really this kind of being the first sermon that Jesus preaches, or the first episode where we have a clear account of. He raises this up from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, and starts around verse 14 and continues on from there. So you can pick up a Bible, you can pause this video and read it if you want. But within this narrative, what Jesus does is he's in the synagogue back on the Sabbath day, and he's asked to read from the scrolls. He unrolls the scroll, chooses a particular place in the prophet Isaiah to speak, and these are the words from the prophet: "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then Jesus rolled the scroll back up and said, "This has been fulfilled in your hearing this day." That's essentially his first sermon. And so he's looking at this saying, if this is the first thing that the Gospels give us, or at least Luke's Gospel gives us, as what Jesus unrolls and said, what can we take from this? And I preached on this past Sunday, so you can certainly go back to the Sunday service if you want to hear how I approached this from the proclamation of the word. It does highlight a lot of the central themes that even I will uplift at this point. But he starts off this chapter by highlighting his own paradigm shift that came from his life as a young person and his theological education, that he came out of an evangelical background, and from that evangelical background, the focus was always on the glories in the hereafter. So essentially, not that life now wasn't worth living, but the focus really was on what the blessings of eternal life would offer. And so the way that Scripture was read and understood often reflected that focus on the next chapter of life rather than on the current chapter. And that in his theological education, he got exposed to something called the social gospel. This is another thing you can look up. You can pause this video, do a quick Google search, and that'll give you an overview of the social gospel. The social gospel, kind of a core idea within this, and I'm not really doing it justice, so again, better to kind of do your own research. But a core piece of the social gospel is that what Jesus calls us to, the gospel of Jesus Christ, is to actually respond to issues here and now, that there is a call to move society towards what it should reflect, towards societal improvements. That we're called not to actively wait until the afterlife to enjoy what it should be. The call of the gospel is to usher in the kingdom of heaven here and now. And so the social gospel is laying before us inequities and calling for us to respond to them. And what we find then in Jesus' unrolling of the scroll and what he proclaims in some ways aligns with this social gospel. Now, he does share in a great kind of humorous way his first sermon as a way to kind of compare it to Jesus. It's apparently very short, or we don't have more said from Jesus, so quite short in that, in what he says. He shares how much time he spent making his first sermon and what he did or didn't say. I can remember some of my earliest sermons. When I got nervous, I spoke really fast, and so they ended up being short just by virtue of how fast I said everything. And I remember being told, we know you have a lot of good things to say, but you're saying them so fast that we can't hear them, so you just need to slow down. Now, he goes from this to remind us not of how abbreviated Jesus' sermon is, but to understand the context of the gospel, something that he has also tried to lay bare in the prior two chapters of the introduction in chapter 1. And that Luke is writing to us 50 plus years after the death of Jesus or his public ministry, which means that as Luke writes down this gospel, he is responding to the next generation of believers, or maybe even two generations. So not those who directly journeyed with Jesus, but to those who are coming to it now. So understanding then the context into which Luke wrote versus the time of Jesus is going to shift the paradigm into what is most important or what is needed to be heard. So to kind of bear that in mind. And so for Luke, this is also based on what he highlights about Jesus is going to speak to the next generation about what the most important things are about being a follower of Jesus. So when we have this first sermon, we sort of have, in the eyes of Mike Graves, Jesus' stump speech. This is what Jesus is going to be all about. This is what his ministry is going to be focused on. This is the launch of it. So while he's been going around the countryside of Galilee, as he goes home and says this, he's essentially saying what everything he is going to do is going to be focused on, who it's going to be focused on, and what it's going to be all about. And so we hear it's going to be good news to the poor. He goes on to really look at the different categories that are highlighted from the prophet here. And so we have captivity, blindness, oppression. And using another author, he has a reflection on what the opposite of those things are. And what that author bore out is the opposite of those are affluence, autonomy, safety, and power. And so as much as we can say that Jesus was speaking to this sense of the poor, good news to the poor in all of these different categories, as we sit in our contemporary times, we are facing realities in which there are still so many that align within these categories that Luke was writing to way back in the first century. And often it's those of us that are in positions of affluence, autonomy, safety, and power that have the advantage of being able to, I suppose, see this or understand this and to reflect on the statistics which bear out this truth. Now, in the time that Luke wrote, and certainly in Jesus's time, actually prior to Jesus's time, or prior to the influence of Rome over modern day Israel, Palestine, is you had Judaism within it had ideas about lengths of time that debt would be forgiven, and provisions in there where people were not burdened with things that defined them for their entire existence, such as indebtedness. And by the time that we have Rome coming in the Roman Empire being the empire over all that area, these conditions became lifelong conditions. So the conditions that Jesus uplifts of captivity, blindness, oppression, poor, blessed are the poor, are permanent conditions in the time of Roman occupation. And the only folks who enjoyed something different were those who were actual citizens of Rome. And so for everybody but that, these were the conditions that they lived under. So when Jesus says this, he's saying something very revolutionary and in some ways alarming to those who are in power as well. Now, this is a call in his sense, Mike Graves' sense, that this is not just about meeting immediate needs. So when we have Jesus lift up this prophecy, he is calling out not just the need to meet the immediate concerns, but to respond to what has caused the underlying issues. So why is it that the poor have no food? Why is it that there are those that are in a prison situation and recidivism that end up essentially in a cycle of imprisonment throughout their life? So addressing not only the immediate of responding to a person's direct physical hunger, but what are the conditions that have led to the fact that this person is poor and doesn't have adequate food? And now, what Jesus follows after reading from the prophet Isaiah is to identify to these townspeople that are impressed with how he has spoken, that they're not able to really receive this message because they are kind of comfortable where they are, and that those who are going to be capable of receiving and acting on this message are those who are really looked down upon by the society in general. And this is what leads his townspeople to be so embarrassed by what he says and upset by it that they want to take him out of town and toss him off a cliff. And so, speaking out and saying difficult things to those who live in comfort can ultimately lead to being driven away because it highlights an economy which is exploitative. It highlights those who are excluded intentionally and unintentionally, and it uplifts those that are deemed undesirable for any number of reasons. Now, where Mike Graves comes at this is to say these issues are still prevalent and perhaps even more so or differently. So incarceration, as I said, the cycle of recidivism and how often incarcerated individuals just end up in this continued cycle of being back in jail after being released. Well, you carry, unfortunately, that weight of incarceration and conviction with you to such a degree that it eliminates opportunities in employment and other things which can make it very difficult to gain any sort of living and not be stuck in a cycle of poverty. And at least in an imprisoned situation, you have food on the table or a variety of other things. Poverty itself being something that can be cyclical and go on from generation to generation. And Jesus is calling on people to see, to genuinely observe and see the conditions, the inequity, how wrong the economy is set up, how the system is rigged, if you will, and how much it is based on profit and some winning while most are always at the losing end if they're even seen at all, or just simply seen as a statistic and not as a full person. And so we can look at poverty, we can look at housing, those who can afford housing and those who can't, who qualify for mortgages and who can't, government aid programs, how they, while are intended to help out those who have very little, end up being programs which help out those who are already comfortable, such as college saving programs, for example, or other things like that. And our sense in savings, people that have retirement and investments, are those who are already in some ways in a situation to be able to put aside stuff like that. So it's going to continue to have the ability to benefit them. And there are those that never have enough and can't ever manage to save enough or put anything away to get to that place. So we have to be willing to respond, and we have to first be able to respond at our own tables. So in the sense of our direct places, opening our tables to those that perhaps society has left aside or sees as undesirable, opening up our neighborhoods in the same way, that they may be places that all can truly find housing in a reasonable way, and more broadly in sweeping reforms and with a genuine response. And so there is a need not only to recognize the issue and to respond in small ways, sharing a meal, looking at our neighborhoods, but also in broad ways to say there has to be sweeping reforms if it's going to align with what Jesus says. He uses a story, it's one that I've heard before, an old parable about a girl on a beach throwing stranded starfish back into the ocean. As far as the eye can see, starfish lie scattered across the sands. And a cynic asks, "What are you doing? Look at them all. Do you really think that's going to make a difference?" And the girl throws another one back and says, "It made a difference to that one." So he concludes, in Luke's gospel, a life worth living happens before we die, starting with caring for the poor and marginalized. These are the kinds of things you're signing up for if you dare to follow Jesus, to live the way he lived his one wild and precious life. Let me share with you the questions at the close of the chapter for you to ponder and perhaps respond to. And I'll be back next week for chapter 3, the next installment of our study. So number 1, there is no biblical support for the idea that entering heaven requires a reference letter. Still, when you read the quote from James Forbes, that quote was what he started the chapter with. Let me read it to you. No one gets into heaven without a reference letter from the poor. When you read that quote about no one getting in without the backing of the poor, how does that strike you? Number 2, since the word gospel means good news, do you tend to think of that news as spiritual, social, or some kind of combination? Number 3, Jesus' sermon on caring for the least is picked up by D.L. Mayfield, who writes about the, quote, myth of the American dream. When you think about our striving after affluence, autonomy, safety, and power, how does Jesus' sermon speak to you? Number 4, why do you think we often read the biblical passages on poverty as symbolic, but the economic news of our day literally? How were you taught to read the Bible? And number 5, if Jesus' words were good news for the poor and a challenge for the wealthy, where do you see yourself on that scale? If challenged, what might need to change in your one wild and precious life? Oh, there's 2 more questions. Number 6, reflecting on Jesus' care for the poor, do any particular phrases, quotes, stories, or images stand out to you? How do these speak to the way you hope to live your one wild and precious life? What wild and precious dreams come to mind? And number 7, is there an image, a poem, or a song that comes to mind reflecting what caring for the poor means to you? Tap into your inner artist if you dare and create your own piece. All right, we'll be back next week for the next chapter in our study, Jesus' vision for your one wild and precious life.